Okay, 1, 2,
Is it
3.
running?
Yep, go.
Good evening. Evening here. I want to speak fairly informally in this little program and pretty much off the cuff because I'm going to talk about a project that I and my friend and partner, associate, interlocutor, Chris Maloney, a project that we are in the early stages of preparing. It's very complicated in, as it were, a linear discussion to explain what's going to happen in this project, and that project is a small program, because to fully appreciate it one needs to be aware of a very large number of things simultaneously. At best I could unfold them one by one, and in the unfolding try to show connections, and as things unfold down the track a little bit I try to show further connections as to how things all perhaps fitted together and fitted together in historical time. A kind of a focus for what we'll look to present a study on is events that occurred in the 1650s in Paris, particularly surrounding the Irish College. This was connected with the Sorbonne and with the extraordinary educative and critical activities associated with the University of Paris. It's in the Latin Quarter of Paris, right there, part of and adjacent to the extended left bank, which many people have heard about. But it's a time of the emerging glory of Louis XIV and the spectacular Paris of a cultural and theatre life, the likes of which have seldom occurred before or after. Something else was going on, however, and that was the, if you like, of that larger picture of both the forces of the Reformation, the break away from the Mother Catholic Church, centred first and foremost around Rome, and the breakaway through the Lutherans and subsequently the Calvinists into a larger sort of Protestant world. There's a third stream going on, so beside the area of this great surge of cultural awareness, the renewal of awareness, the surge of spirituality, and then the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, as was already coming into play by mid-17th century. As I say, a third thing, and that was the emergence of science. It was the English, but also coming through, particularly Paris was spectacular in the development of mathematics and the emergence of applied mathematics in the examination of physical phenomena. We are talking of that time that falls in the lifetime of the great René Descartes. The emergence of Cartesian geometry, etc. In the English context, there emerged a so-called struggle between the ancients and the moderns. This is where this whole notion of modernism arose. This is the time. Now, I've just been offering a certain amount of context to you because there was centering around the Irish College and in that Latin Quarter in Paris, because in that Latin Quarter that there was the so-called Port Royal institution. This was like a convent for young women, as well as a sort of a base for a certain theological standpoint, indeed that of Jansenism. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. It included that. It included the Sorbonne, i.e. the Theological Faculty of the University of Paris, and the Irish College as an important educational cultural establishment, and important for a number of reasons again, which will sort of come forward in a moment. But our project centres on things that occurred there. Prominently in the 1650s, but they are profoundly connected in the view that I'm forming, profoundly connected not only with issues at work in Paris, and there, as I've already mentioned, the Jansenists. To get it clear, Jansenism was a view within the framework of the Catholic Church, a view that was influenced by the theological propositions advanced by Calvin. And a most important proposition there was the so-called predestinationism. If an all-knowing God embraces not only the total universe in a spatial sense, but also in an eternal sense, that in the all-knowingness, the destination of each individual soul must already be predetermined if it is known to God. We may not know it, but if God does, then the predetermination of each soul is. This was a position sort of held quite strongly by, well, held decisively by Calvin, and it persuaded Bishop Jansen. This is a cleric and theologian arising from Brussels and from the University of de Louvain. This Jansenist position, its greatest champion in Paris was the famous and justly famous writer Blaise Pascal, whose great works were written in the 1650s and were written specifically to advance, with his greatest literary merit and intellectual clarity he could muster, to advance the case of Jansenism against the opponent as he saw it, that being the Orthodox Catholicism represented by, in particular, the Jesuits. The Orthodox position of the Church emanating from Rome is that human beings are free. The predestination of a soul could thus not be. If we were predestined, then the whole foundation for morality is removed. That the sense of our freedom becomes an illusion to us, and that conformity to the instructions derived from scriptural resources is the only thing that one is required to do, as it were. More of this in a little while. So, the Jesuit position, we are free, we are moral, we as a consequence have to bear the consequences of our decisions and our choices. The Jansenist position is, it's already decided, so just act in accordance with the Bible or with the scriptural dictates and the dictates of the great interpreters of Scripture, and you can be certain that if you deviated therefrom, the great possibility was that your soul was doomed. In any case, now there's a third position at work, and this is a most amazing and significant position, and it has always had great difficulties in gaining acceptance. Indeed, there's been a series of major rejections of this position by the official church, and yet this position is not only wholly persuasive, but if one really wanted to look more closely into these things, at the risk of being heretical, one could see that this may be the position that lives in the teachings of Jesus Christ, the whole point of the New Testament. So, how to approach this question? And I've got to start from a certain assumptions philosophically, and they, in a sense, already put me on a bus to certain destinations in terms of logical trains. There's certain presuppositions at work. However, the most general starting point that I have is that, and this is immediately the contentious point, I want to say that there is sort of one universe, and one complete, coherent set of details, propositions, whatever you like, which unify into, as I say, an integrated or coherent oneness. This immediately puts me, as I'm suggesting, a sort of an underlying monotheistic position. But this, I think I'm compelled to do, because if I wish to understand something, then I'll have to unify, logically, all the elements that constitute that understanding. The capacity of forming understanding itself suggests to me, having to make a wise decision here, suggests to me that it is wise to proceed that not only is the universe one, and there's a certain stability of a truth within it, but this oneness, or this capacity to understand it, or the understanding of it, is kind of available to me. That's the presupposition I'm working with. Pardon me. Now, it's understandable, and there's one truth. There's one implication, and this is the one that I want to draw out at this stage of the game. I believe that those people preoccupied with theology, understood in this widest and deepest sense, are at work on essentially the same task as the philosophers. As a consequence, that philosophy and theology can assist each other, and eventually, even though they are travelling perhaps on different trains and buses, all will ideally arrive at the same destination. So I'm kind of including these sorts of considerations. Now, it looks circuitous and it looks irrelevant, so let me just ask this sort of a really basic question now. Are human beings innately good? It's a very, very fundamental question. Are we innately good? Now you've got basically three propositions or three possibilities. Yes, we are. No, we are not. Or we start off neither good nor bad, and somewhere along the line, life experiences, wise teaching at school, guidance by parents gets us good or bad. Good or bad then becomes contingent. You may or may not, just the same as today I'm wearing a blue shirt, tomorrow I may be wearing a red one. The shirt, the colour of the shirt I wear is contingent. Are we innately good? Is it intrinsic to our constitution that we are good? Or is it intrinsic to our constitution that we are bad or not good? Or are we a tabula rasa, as Locke the great empiricist would have us be? No innate ideas, so presumably no innate moral ideas. Now, in the broader orthodoxy, theological orthodoxy, that has, in the very early, in the Old Testament and Genesis, there we encounter Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, in the Garden of Garden of Eden. And but Adam is tempted into what is in fact an evil. He eats the forbidden fruit, violates the instructions, divine instructions, and thereby sins. And by this sin, Adam, and on behalf of all of us, we fall, or at least according to an important theological theory developed by the great Bishop of Hippo, nowadays Tripoli in Libya, the great St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. He developed the notion of original sin, i.e. that by virtue of Adam's error, humanity has been cast out, and a sin performed by Adam now infects all his progeny, all of us. The original sin can be first and foremost washed away through the baptism into the Christian church. That's sort of the logic of... However, if there is a transmission of sin, then the only way that can occur somehow or other is through the procreational process. And if the procreational process transmits sin, then it is intrinsically sinful itself. This opens all manner of difficulty, because this issue of celibacy starts to come into play in connection with these notions. Furthermore, those things connected with procreation and loving affection, for example, leading to sexual union between a young man and a young woman, has got a sort of a shadow cast over it by a theory developed in particular by St. Augustine. So, We've got another thing. Adam may have been intrinsically good, innately good, and he may have done harm to himself, according then to Augustine, and indeed is the view followed very widely and historically, since Augustine is one of the great doctors or fathers of the church. And baptism into the church is absolutely crucial. The christening of a child is an important ritual intended to defend the soul of the baby. It's a serious matter in the minds of very serious people. Okie doke. Now, is there a tradition in which the innate goodness of the human being exists and is unaffected by the transmission of Adam's sin through the procreational process? And the answer is that there has been a tradition, and the most peculiar tradition, and it's got itself into difficulties with the established orthodoxy. Now, this tradition was one that took shape in the coming together of a Christian teaching that somebody now known to us as St. Patrick, a Christian teaching that Patrick brought to Ireland, to Celtic peoples who had deeper contact. These are folk who were never Romanised. These were folk who lived, if you want to call it a sort of an Iron Age culture, that one which had not been citified, had not been a great mass habituation to organised, socially stabilising power structures. Folk who lived by their wits, lived communally, and lived in, let's say, a kind of a purity of simplicity. Perhaps I'll put it like that. I've seen it written that when Patrick went to Ireland, that the Iron Age Celtic folk there, who, believe me, seem to have lived a very harsh existence, and one which had its share of brutishness, without doubt. But it had a strength in it as well. But these were a people who were Christianised, who adopted Christianity. See, in a sense, what goes hand in hand with that, as I've seen it written, when Christianity was adopted as an official religion by the Roman Empire, Christianity was drawn in and was Romanised. It was imperialised. It became shaped so as to fulfil a role within the context of that larger power structure that was the Roman Empire, with all its merits, but with all its large imperial bureaucracies, power systems, systems of elites, and so on and so on. Now, a great change happened in Ireland through its Christianisation. And that great change, amongst other things, brought a cessation of some of the extraordinary brutish practices. And, for example, and the most important, if you want, a litmus test, and for me a litmus test is sort of how people relate to each other. Any society which finds it perfectly tolerable for the enslavement of other human beings who finds that perfectly tolerable, one has to wonder what the underlying view on human nature and morality may be, because to my mind, slavery compromises the dignity of a human being. That dignity arises out of, let's say, the possession of the soul and a motivation to do good and to be conscious even of the moral issues involved, and to be conscious about the direction of their compassion and whatever you like. Through Patrick, there was not only a calming down in Ireland, but the emergence of a new type of, you'd have to call it a loving type of consciousness. Hard things were going on, but a profound change occurred such that there's a great love of learning and the valuing of the inner movement of the human spirit, the expression of that spirit into books that embodied great labours of thought and concern. In Ireland, they developed this fantastic practice of the copying of the book and the preparation of these enormous treasures of the spirit. What view of human nature is at work there? So, a Christianity seems to have emerged in Ireland, initiated by Patrick's mission there, and built upon by several seemingly very wonderful people. This is not to deny that wonderful people existed elsewhere. But nevertheless, something quite important arose. In that system of circumstances that arose, a history of, let's call it, Iron Age law was modified and developed, and a law system in which a sort of a wisdom arising out of not the official church teaching, but a wisdom arising directly out of the New Testament, and in many ways a teaching arising out of the Gospel of St. John, got in and facilitated the shaping of a law system which has become known as the Brechon laws. Brechon, or the wise men, and coming from Druidic backgrounds, that these people were known as Brechons or Bretons, something like that. I think this is why eventually the name Britannia arose for the Romans when they invaded what now is known as England. So, if one could imagine then a legal system within which is embodied that part of Christianity that seems to spring from Jesus Christ himself, as is seen in particularly the Gospel of St. John. Not a package stemming from the book of Genesis, book of Moses, all the way through to the end of the New Testament, because it's only in 325 at Nicaea was a decision made as to what adds up to the Bible. It takes a long time for all that stuff to get around, books to be copied. Patrick took the Gospel of St. John, and it is in its own way, philosophically, a great and wonderful piece of work. In any case, that Gospel of John, coupled with the teachings of Jesus, moving into the Brechon law situation, seem to have produced a viewpoint which has it that human beings are innately good. How else would they understand that which Jesus spoke to them? There's no cajoling by Jesus, certainly no big stick taken out to teach tough lessons of morality. The goodness that lies within every human being seems to be the underlying assumption of what Jesus says in the Gospel of St. John. Now, once you've got this notion of innate goodness, and you've got the Gospel of John, a number of important sort of philosophical considerations emerge. Now here's the obvious one. The prologue, the first kind of part of the Gospel of St. John, says and offers a conception which is totally remarkable and which has absolutely certainly captured the imagination of the Greek Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, particularly through Plotinus. It's very influential on Augustine, and it absolutely is manifest in the Gospel of St. John. And that is that the Word becomes flesh. That the Logos is it is not only immanent to the process of the creation of that which is created, but it is a formative influence, and in a sense it must be logically prior to the creation, for the creation to be as it is. It's a remarkable consideration. The words of Jesus in the Gospel of St. John should be understood as the Word of God fleshly offered to humanity, let's say. Something along those lines is offered. And to say that the conduct of Jesus and in what is said shows, yes, sins occur. Let he among you who is without sin throw the first stone. Yep. All that sort of attitude is there. Yes, sins are made. But if the loving kindness, the role of love, of that hopeful compassion, this can only resonate in human beings who already have the wherewithal within them to receive it, to relate to it, to be inspired, to be liberated, and to be empowered by it. This power is an intrinsic thing in people. Now that certainly seems to me the position in the Gospel of St. John, and that was the position taken to be so in Ireland. Now, an extraordinary thing happened because, you know, it's a well-known story how missionaries moved from Ireland after the great destruction of brought about on the Roman Empire by the breakthrough from the north of the Germanic tribes and the Frankish tribes, and then further on people coming from the east. This massive collapse of an empire that had got past its use-by date, probably in any case, but a collapse, a destruction of the library, not dissimilar to when the Turks came through the glorious Arab Arabic developments in the 9th and 10th century. The Turks just smashed everything before they finally worked out what they were smashing. And then it was irreplaceable, the great libraries that had been burnt. Now, in Ireland, a rescue mission actually occurred, but it occurred not as a rescue mission, but occurred because the books were directly treasured by people who felt the importance of their contents and took enormous trouble to perpetuate the content of the books and to expand their number. The beautiful thing about the books is that by copying them, the initial book is not diminished in any way, and yet a new treasure is made. It is insofar as nowadays as talk about a win-win, this one is great. The book is the means for the teaching and the uplift. Now, let's cover another consideration so we see then the importance of the books. A pantheistic notion arises out of this sense of God being the creator and God being immanent, indwelling in all aspects of the creation. Either God perhaps is a sort of some old guy, man with a white beard in a throne on the other side of the sky, or he may be a profound mystery, unexplainable but nevertheless disconnected from the creation, or this pantheistic model, which is found in a series of the most wondrous imaginative metaphysicians through the whole history of human consciousness. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake, and here I may be advancing heresy, but Bruno had a notion of God as the soul of the universe and nature as the living garment of God. These are wondrous visions, but the issue that arises here is how does the human individual soul then relate? If God is all, then the human individual is swamped, is diminished, is lost. Now, in the mid-9th century, one of the most remarkable of all philosophers, known to us as John Scotus Eriugena, as part of this broader Irish movement, but arrived in Paris. He taught at the Palatinate School, which subsequently evolved into the University of Paris. In other words, this is an extraordinary influence right at the very roots of what has become the Sorbonne. Now, Eriugena's organised viewpoint seems to come without precedent to a lot of the scholars who look at things and appears to be such a rigorous and comprehensive and profound philosophy that he is as prominent in the first half of the Middle Ages as a thinker as if one would have the Empire State Building stuck in the middle of the Sahara Desert. It is that profound, and one sees some scholars wondering how these things have come about, feel that he may have conjured these things up just on a quiet night by himself over a glass of wine. What Eriugena seems to have done is to have gathered together the view of human nature, which became active in the Brehon laws, a view of human nature which has it that we are innately good, that in the so-called major treatise, The Division of Nature, he seems to have found a way of expressing how the individual human soul, which is the seat of our freedom, our morality, the seat of our freedom, how that could be simultaneously with God and free of God. Furthermore, in the innately good, in a sense what Eriugena has picked up is this, it's not a Platonic tradition, it's a Socratic tradition. Now, just to come back to this question, are we good or are we not good, innately or not? Anybody who takes the trouble to look into Socrates' role, particularly as is shown to us through the dialogues of Plato, sees Socrates as revealing how a slave boy, in Greece there were slaves, the home of democracy had a lot of slaves. But Socrates reveals to all in attendance that this young fellow, if given a chance to put his mind to address and direct his thoughts soundly through right questions, can solve Pythagoras' theorem. I mean, in a go, Socrates shows that this slave boy is just another human being endowed with intelligence, endowed with all these capacities, capable of participating in intelligent conversation, and capable, by being asked the right questions, to find from out of himself the answers to solve Pythagoras' theorem. Okay. So this is the Socrates we're talking about. Now Socrates has phrased the whole question about goodness and are we innately, he's put it slightly different. Socrates wants to know what's the origin of evil. How does evil come about? Evil is there. How does it come about? What seems to arise, or better still, let me tell you what Socrates says first of all. Socrates' view is that evil arises out of ignorance and stupidity. Ignorance is just being an insufficiency of knowledge and awareness. Stupidity is a failure or a slothfulness of reflection. By learning and reflecting, one reduces the chance of being or creating evil. The solution to the problem of evil, from a Socratic point of view, is the gaining of wisdom. And that if we despise evil and we wish to minimise it, then our best policy is to maximise the chance, particularly the youth of the land, to maximise the chance of them becoming wise. Now this is a Socratic position. And to get it clear, this is Eriugena's position, and this is the great position of Ireland after the teaching of Jesus was set amongst people who, in their innate goodness, as is every other creature, indeed even the sort of dogs that we befriend in our homes, the Irish, through the treasuring of the books, not everybody, but the treasuring of the books, an enormous practice. The Jesus they knew was the Jesus who was the absolute luminous wisdom of moral profundity. For people innately good and realising that stupidity and ignorance led us astray and allowed evil to occur, that suddenly the fantastic gift arising through these books, this gift to transcend the ignorance, to give us the means by which we reflect better, that we seek to be less stupid that we always find ourselves being. This is the movement that started, and this got integrated into the Brechon law system, or into the old system, the old ways. People sought to get rid of the brutishness and replace it by better ways, i.e. those ways that were more manifestly appropriate to people innately good. The nature of sin that then emerges out of these considerations, if we are innately good and we give rise to evil, then sin is a self-violation. If the propensity in our souls is to do good and we make mistakes, that the evil is the spiritual impoverishment and the spiritual harming of ourselves. It was Eriugenes' position that sin bears within it its own punishment. The Brechon law system did not have a view of retribution, punishment as retribution for wrongdoing, which arises and which is it is just the standard assumption of the Old Testament. This back in Patrick's time, the Old Testament had not reached the level of prominence that it has now. Was the sort of Lombard and the sentences and the action in the Sorbonne that seemed to unify Old and New Testament, try and find a way, a system of compromise. The role of the whole development of the dialectic was to find a way of synthesising a unity out of what appeared to be a vast body of contradictions. Patrick didn't bother with that stuff. The Gospel of John was enough. You only had to find out what the Word of God emanating from earthly, fleshly existence and its merit. You didn't need to know that it was divinity. You didn't even know. You only had to listen. Truly an honest man, listening with the full openness of his heart and his mind, would see this is right. It cannot be any other way than this. So, this Brechon law tradition, and this tradition that sin is like a wound. It's a spiritual wound to the soul. And that we all, sure, if a sin and evil is done to a person, restitution is sort of the right thing to do. But when somebody wounds his soul in the performance of an evil, this is a tragedy for the community, tragedy of the family, and all sort of reach out to try and help this person who has performed a wound to his soul. It's a sort of it's a different sort. It's a community of compassion and social concern. Now, this Eriugena appears to the thinking that I've got as the clarification and the bringing together and the opening out of the immanent philosophical content of an extraordinary cultural formation, given partly an expression in the Brechon laws, partly an expression in the immense labour of the scribes, the immense effort to undertake missions to Scotland, then in through Wales into England, Northumbria, and then pushing out into Europe, and in particular through the sort of Picardy and those northern places. Now, anything as potent as this position enunciated by Eriugena, and Eriugena, in other words, what I'm saying, his role in philosophy is not dissimilar to that of Bach's in music. The great Johann Sebastian Bach did not arise as some sort of, I don't know, spontaneous creation out of northern Germany or something like that. No. Bach was the great unifier and opening out and the distiller of all that was best in the whole history of music up until his day. This appears to me approximately what Eriugena did. But as he's brought together some truly powerful achievements that have occurred in the history of responsible human intelligence, the work to the scholars, it looks like, as I say, Empire State Building in the middle of the desert. Unfortunately, because scholars really rely upon documents to undertake their work. If the documents all got burnt, what do you do? Just leave it blank, or do you think? Eriugena and he thought, and he could distill out what were the essences alive in giving coherent shape to this law tradition, this social customs, this practices that he participated in. Eriugena was not a priest, just a learned philosopher. It appears to me that the Eriugenian influence was very strong, not only in Paris, but it helped widen and strengthen Irish consciousness as such, as certainly amongst a sort of some part of its intelligentsia. At this stage of the game, I'm prepared to make a historical claim that this Eriugenian influence, that influence being, as I have said, as a gathering together and a sort of a distilled unification of this profound thing that happened, and it happened in Ireland, that got into, and that in many ways that Sorbonne had alive within it that tradition. Now, if we get ourselves back to the 1650s, what appears to have been the case is that at the Irish College in the 1650s, that there was, and indeed an intense struggle. The Irish masters of the Sorbonne and of the theological faculty knew who they were, and they shared a common position. Superficially, if you look back on it, oh, they were Irish nationalists. No. They understood themselves as stewards of a profound heritage that was their duty to propagate to young souls thirsting for that wisdom that would enable them to behave better than otherwise they would. To know more, and to know more wisely, and to be able to take a phrase from the great Denis Diderot, to behave in such ways such that when they die they merited being part of the human race. Now, so while it looks like a struggle between the Jansenists and the Jesuits, there was actually a third party at work who ran into difficulties, in particular with the Jesuits. Because the Jesuits were people who very, very able people, and whose beliefs and worked according to what they felt to be the soundest, wisest, best possible belief, but came from a tradition arising from St. Augustine and coming through the great Thomas Aquinas into an orthodoxy tinged, let's say, with Spanish culture. St. Ignatius Loyola was active in formulating their whole Society of Jesus as a movement within the Catholic Church. So, the point of the project then would be to open up the considerations that bear upon this struggle that went around and seemed to be moving in the streets around the Irish College, Port Royal just down the road there, Sorbonne just up the road there, people milling around, a lot of hot discussion going on all over, important academic people, and filtering down without doubt the students, senior students were perfectly aware of what was going on, such that it would have spilt out and across the left bank and into the theatre districts. I'm certain in my own mind. Call it a hunch, but who knows even how hunches are revealed to the human mind. But nevertheless, I'm confident on the positions between the ancients and the moderns, and the modernist position ultimately requires for us to be free, and not only free but positively free. Through our conceiving of possibilities, we can give rise to the new. We should go forward. It's a Socratic position, that this is the position to be found in Eriugena. It's a position that will not accept predestinationism. Eriugena wrote an important tract against predestinationism going back in sort of 840. I mean, sort of, we're talking about 600-700 years before Calvin and Luther. Those guys still went back to that sort of consideration. So in any case, that this against the Jansenists and not accepting the position of the Jesuits, this is the Irish position, active and defended through the Irish College, and taken further forward. That as the things clarified between the ancients and the moderns, those, because it got out into large of the issues of the French politics and Colbert, all the great names were conscious of the dispute between the ancients and the moderns. And at the centre of that, because that modernist position is neither Jesuit nor Jansenist, it's in fact the position of Irish freedom. And through that modern position and the Molières and the great young voice, Fontenelle, voice for the modernists, was carried forward, and which eventually led us on to Voltaire and led us on to the Enlightenment, Diderot and Rousseau, and eventually the step forward that Europe in fact took. So that's the project. I'm not sure that one brief, because I've obviously gone a long time here, and that's the project. And the project bears on questions which are more than weighty. These are central questions to our whole existence. If we are innately good, free, and face the difficulty of actually knowing what to do, if we wish to avoid doing harm to our souls, and in particular not to lead other souls astray. So this And I'm not even Irish, would you believe? I'm not Irish, but I like to be a fair-minded man, fortunate enough to have a very good father who I no doubt believed in the innate goodness of human beings and the importance of thinking very clearly, valuing wisdom and doing your best. Doing your best and looking with the most open possible mind and looking to inform it as best you can. Keep company with thoughtful people and those who value wisdom, because wisdom's not just got a nice flavour, that wisdom is the absolute key to the transcendence of evil. So, hopefully that we can go on. I'm here with a dear friend of mine. Between the two of us, we sort of strive to be true to ourselves and true, authentic human beings, and consequently we try to do good. See you next time.
That was exactly one.